Hi everyone, it's Laura here for Studio Katia, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to create an ocean scene with the new Jawesome stamp set. I started off this card by creating the ocean background itself. I have a piece of Canson XL watercolor cardstock that I die cut with the Scallop Hearts cover die. This is part of the new Studio Katia release. And I'm going to add some color with my Jawesome watercolors. I first wet the entire panel with clean clear water, and then I picked up the pigments directly from the pans and laid them on my background. I am going for a gradient effect, so I scribbled the pigments that are darkest on the bottom of the panel, and I'm going upwards with lighter and lighter colors. But as you can see, I'm not being very careful at all. I just want an easy background that has some color, and actually if the gradient is not smooth and I have some texture, I think the background will look even more interesting. And with this reasoning in mind, I decided to add some droplets with some clean clear water while my background was still wet. And because I really liked the result, I decided to do the same also with the watercolors that I used to create the background itself. So I'm using that same paintbrush to pick up the pigments, and with some flicking motions I'm creating some droplets. At this point the ocean background is ready, and you can either leave it aside to dry, or as I did in this case, you can speed up the heating process with your heat gun. Next, I die cut some more Canson XL watercolor cardstock using the Darling Ribbon and Frames dies. This has an A2 rectangle that I used to cut the outline of this sandbank. And then I created the shape of the sandbank itself, so the curve at the top, using the Trimmings border die, also by Studio Katia. And again, I am adding color to the panel using my Jawesome watercolors. I'm trying to create some variation on the panel, but I'm not using any special technique at all. And once I'm done adding color, I can speed up the drying process with my heat gun. The images I chose today are part of the new Jawesome stamp set. This was included in the March 2019 release by Studio Katia. This set is really fun, and it will work great with the other ocean-themed stamp sets by Studio Katia, but for today's card I decided to use it by itself. I stamped the images with hybrid black ink, and then I did some coloring with my Spectrum Noir markers. The color palette that I chose is quite limited. I have some warm grays for the sharks, some blue grays for the smaller fish, and the rest is mainly coral reds and some pinks, because I wanted to have a nice contrast with the background, and I felt that the red and the pinks would really pop against the ocean background. The coloring for today's images is pretty simple. I used 2 or 3 shades per color. I just had to figure out a palette from the warm grays because I was having a little bit of trouble in blending my highlight marker with my mid-tone marker, and also I didn't feel that my shadows were deep enough. So for that reason I went back and forth between different markers, and the final color scheme that I think would work to reproduce the look that I got without having to use as many markers is BG6, BG3 and BG2. And this is the color palette that I used to color the second shark, because at this point I had figured out what kind of look I was going for and which markers worked better with each other, and so I could just go ahead and directly use those markers. Again, those are the BG6, the BG3 and the BG2. As I do very often, I like to go in with a second layer of color to intensify the contrast and get a nice blend. And then to add a little bit of texture, I used my darker marker, so the BG6, to add some dots on the bellies and on the fins of the sharks. And then I could move on and color the rest of the images. I am using some blue-grays for this bouquet of fish, which is such a fun image. I love that as much as I love the surfboard with the bite mark and the tuna fish in a heart shape. As I said, I think this stamp set is really fun. So to color this fish, I am using BG3, BG2, and then for the heads, just the BG1 marker, because the images are small, so I don't need to use a lot of markers to create some shadows. And then I moved on and colored the surfboard with CR1, CR10 and CR11. These are some coral reds and it's a combination that I don't reach for very often, but I think it's really gorgeous and it worked really nicely with the ocean background I have going on. And I used the same markers to color in that tuna steak. So started with the lightest one and then added some shadows with my mid-tone and the darkest marker and then blended everything out once again. I colored the flowers on the surfboard by adding some yellows at the center of the flowers and then I colored in the leaves. And finally, for the hearts, the ribbons on the fishes as well as on the shark, I used some pinks. Once I was done coloring the images, I die cut them with the coordinating dies and then I moved on and started assembling the card. To add some extra detail to my ocean background, I ran it through my die cutting machine using the second die in the Scallop Hearts cover die. This die cuts all these hearts, but I didn't want to take them out. I just wanted to get an inlay die cutting effect so that I had some extra interest on the background. I coated the entire back of this panel with some foam tape so that the hearts would stay in place. And then I adhered it to a panel that I die cut out of some white cardstock using the rectangle die in the Darling Ribbon and Frames dies. And I really loved the effect of these die cut hearts on the background. I think they add just the right amount of detail. Next, I wanted to adhere my sandbank to the background, but because part of it hangs off the scalloped rectangle, I decided to support it a little bit, so I cut some foam tape in very thin strips that I adhered to the edges of the sandbank. And then before actually gluing it to my card, I cut a little notch on the left side using a craft knife because I wanted to tuck the surfboard in there. I made sure that the cut was wide enough for me to be able to actually slide the surfboard in, and then once I was happy with the result, I could go ahead and actually glue everything down. I used some liquid glue and I covered the back of the sandbank as well as of the surfboard, and then I adhered them to the ocean background. At this point, I could go ahead and add the rest of the images to my scene. I laid them down so that I got an idea of where I wanted everything to go, and then I first adhered the sharks with some foam tape, and then I proceeded with the rest of the images, which I glued down flat to the background. For the sentiment, I decided to do some heat embossing with white embossing powder over some black cardstock. So I am treating my black cardstock with some anti-static powder. I stamped the sentiment "I love you" from the Jawesome stamp set by Studio Katia. I coated that with white embossing powder and then I melted the embossing powder with my heat gun. I used my guillotine trimmer to obtain a thin banner for my sentiment, and then I adhered that flat on top of my card front. I always love adding finishing touches and this card is no exception. So I used a white gel pen to add some highlights to the sharks and to those little heart bubbles. I then coated the heart bubbles with Nuvo drops in Morning Dew. This will dry transparent and will just leave a glossy finish to those elements. And I added them to the ribbon too. And then I decided that the sandbank was a little bit too flat, so I first tried to add some texture with a Z Clean Color Real Brush Marker, but I wasn't liking the effect. So what I did is I mixed in a brown with the same pans that I used to paint the sandbank in the first place. And then with a water brush I created some scribbles that added just the right amount of texture to that element. And I liked the result better that way. I mounted the card front on a side folding A2 card base. So this is cut at 5.5 by 8.5 inches and it's scored at 4.25 inches. And then I couldn't resist and I decided to add a bit of sparkle using a Spectrum Noir clear overlay pen. And that finished off my card. And that's it for today. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and I hope I inspired you to create with the Studio Katia Jawesome stamp set. Don't forget to subscribe to the Studio Katia channel for more inspiration. Thank you all so much for stopping by and have a great day.